All right, welcome back to Graphics Addict. I'm Herb, and I am the author of the Lost Astronaut Studios game creation framework, a Win32 C++ extravaganza of 1,800 plus classes, yada yada. If you haven't seen the GL window video, and you haven't seen the, specifically the intro to GL window video, and if you haven't seen the legalese video, please take a look at those. But this is for beginners who are just getting to know the framework, and this will be featured on our growing wiki on the GitHub page. Anyway, just wanted to, expound upon some of the options you have with GL Window and cover its integration with processors, or the process suite. Weird name, I know. You might think of this as, well, it's inspired by processing, although, as a graphics programmer, processing was not the greatest for graphics programming, although it did get people ramped up. And processing IDE is, for what it is, very good. But there are inefficiencies to the way that you tend to write things in that language. And as always, we're drinking something. Today, pu'er, a fermented tea. Anyway, I want these videos to be pretty quick, so I thought I'd just delve into the use of process and what these things are. So just kind of give you an overview of these features. So we're looking under framework. We're looking at the process folder with the 2 5s, PROCE55. There are 4 filter folders here. One is controllers and viewers. One is FX, processors, linear. Let's look at linear for a second. What is that? So linear is a way to display presentations. A presentation is very similar to like a PowerPoint, where you have a series of slides, in quotes, slides, and these slides are showing you some animation, maybe. There are ways to make these slides not advance until you click a button or something. So it's a way to kind of show a progression from 1 to, X number of slides. I used this initially to create a background, repeating, procedurally generated star field with little ships that fly around in it and stuff for Empire in the Sky. And it was also useful for creating small animations that, so in Atlas Tile Editor, you can actually export the content to a film strip or a film set of frames. So your animation can be saved out and then manipulated in another program or loaded back into the engine as a film. It's a programmatic approach. So you're not playing a video, you're just showing little things moving around. And you can use mainly this visual aid class. This is like an element that you put into a slide. But you can also use some of the FX classes. So these are all of the FX classes. Anyway, that's the linear set. And that is its own world. And we will have a video about just that coming up. This is just an overview of what is in the process area and what it's used for. So you can think of a processor as literally a joke or a riff on the fact that it's a CPU side animation. There's a lot of talk in graphics about how everything is done on the GPU and we should do more and more on the GPU and it should be done on the GPU. GPU. But there are just things that you can do and have to do on the CPU side that matter and can, show off as a 2D games. If you think of Game Maker and you're creating these scripted sprites, that's an excellent example of a CPU side entity that has nothing to do with the sun has arrived. The sun is in my camera. I apologize. Anyway, it's a CPU side thing. Something that uses the graphics card to render itself, but is generally being updated by the CPU. So, closing out on that. So you have the processor class, and the processor class is an entity, and that entity can be added to some sort of controller class. Those controllers, and controller may not be the best term, let's call it a bookshelf. A processor is a book, and a process viewer is like a bookshelf that you must place that on. So anyway, there are a couple of different ones. So the processor itself has many features, and a lot of them are related to the same kinds of features that you'd find in the GL window class. So it handles input, it can handle animation, it's time-based. Right here on line 78, we have the standard time tracking variables. Expired, which is the amount of seconds expired, expressed as a decimal. Duration, which is a length or a special point at which we consider it to have gone through some sort of transformation. It might be the end, or it just might be the end of the beginning for this processor's lifespan. Because now we're talking about something that is either perpetual, always on the screen, removed manually by some programmatic button press or whatever, or it's something that has its own lifespan, that when it hits the duration, it is deleted from the list or hidden so that it's no longer shown, or otherwise manipulated. And so when you take the ratio of expired over duration, you get a percentage of completion expressed as a ratio from 0 to 1. And this lets you interact with the tween library and color manipulation, lerping, interpolation, things like that, allow you to animate. So a processor is a particle that's controlled by the CPU. A processor is an enemy, is a player, is a button, it's a slider, it's an animation. There's a width, a height, a location. Now, the XY value generally means the upper left of a rectangle, but it can also mean the center. Back to what I was saying. So you've got your time, you've got your XY width, height, X2, Y2, basically the same thing as a Cartesian rectangle. But the XY can also be interpreted as the center of the object, and W and H, W can be considered a radius. Then it's got these position, velocity, center, offset, and this is used in rendering and also in updating and animating. And then there's some toggles and things for some of the features. So let's talk about the quote-unquote bookshelves that these processors get put onto. The simplest one is actually contained in the processor file, and that is the processors class, and that's just a list at its simplest level. I'm sorry, I must have. Where is this? Go to definition. All right. Yeah, it's in the same class. All right, so it's in here, and it it accepts with the .add method a processor. Okay, so you can manage a list that way. So it's also got, again, other features, like you can pass a point in to determine which processor the mouse is over. Box test if you want to do a select box, for instance. Or if you have something that's like touching more than one thing. It's going to find only the first one there, actually. So, interesting. In fact, in both of these cases, it's only going to find the first one. Which often means the one on the bottom. But anyway, you can write your own test by looking at this and figuring out how to write those tests. There might be some other features hidden in here. Anyway, just like GL Window Manager, there's a between and a render. This calls all of the processors that belong to it processor debugger. So this is a special class that comes with the framework that is essentially just a thing that describes itself is a rectangle with some other like an X to show like where it is, and it's used only in debugging, and it is located here, and it is a processor. So here is a very simple processor, and here's one that moves randomly. So you need these sometimes. You can add them to your list or stick them in your processor viewer to, just to debug, to find out a little bit about where you are in the world and things like that. I'll just briefly go through the different types of controllers and viewers. Now, there is something called a process controller, and this is actually designed to be added. It's part of a processor, and it allows you to control parts of the processor through various lerping equations that came up commonly in a lot of animations. Although I don't use the feature as much as I used to, it was written to save time, and Visual Aid comes to mind. If you read Visual Aid, or if you start to program a lot of processors, you begin to realize that you're always calculating similar values and then applying them through a variable. And so process controller allows you to do that and calculate that time. And it can control that time, and it can update the variables on it. And then you can look up those variables and apply them to some animation that you're doing. And then that sounds kind of complicated, but it really comes down to like a little calculator class that helps you maintain variables by name. And it was used in some of the FX processors. So if you go into FX, you've got a long list of, pre-existing and variations of them for various things, like a button or a circle menu, or a particle that destroys itself from the list after it's created at some time in the future, or a glow effect, maybe a font is displayed, things like that, so that you can create little presentations. It's all relevant to the presentation class, which is a process viewer. But there's also a fire and forget limited wrapping process viewer. So let's start at the beginning, actually. There's the process viewer 2D. And the process viewer 2D is a GL window that already has the processors integrated into it. And you can actually create a child of process viewer And then you can use the onload to load it up with processors depending on what you wanted it to display. So you could use this as a way to make a little widget or a window or a section or an animation or whatever you'd like. A piece of a level, for instance, could be made inside of this. And basically the FX class is the FX property is a list of processors that are going to be displayed. Here we initialize the processors, and then in the between we update the processors and keep track of the overall time. And then finally we, after incrementing that, render a couple of different layers, and these can be called by either the GL window manager when you add it to the Windows singleton, or they can be called by another GL window that's calling this. And it implements a certain number of the features that are available in a processor. Now, there's an even simpler way of doing this, which is simply to create a processor and then call its between and render whenever you would like to. Or you can put them in this list along with other ones that you need, and then you can call the render in between of the process viewer. So the idea is that in the beginning, I made one window. And then I wanted to make little pieces that were similar to the window in that responded to the mouse, or it responded to the keyboard, or it needed to be created and destroyed in a certain amount of time so that it could be just like a little animation. And so this little shard or sliver of animation then, was only one part of a greater whole. And that greater whole was, one, we wanted to do cutscenes. So I created a presentation, a linear movie style kind of show this slide, show the next slide, show the next slide. Then I created Process Viewer, which was a little bit more laissez-faire, but it had a little bit more than just showing a list. So you could take that processor and add it to a list called processors, or you could add it to a process viewer so that you could pan it around. Because you'll note here that it actually does map all of the keyboard functions for you. And so that's an important reason that I have it here. But that wasn't enough to make a game. It was just enough to make something that you could move around and interact with the keyboard and mouse. So beyond that, I then implemented some other ones that are all related to this process viewer. So this is a very simple one that could handle maybe 100 objects, but we would need to make more complicated ones depending on what we were trying to do overall. So you could use a process viewer to sort of handle that interactivity within one little section. But there was also this idea of zoning. There was an idea of limiting. There was an idea of wrapping. And so all of these implement those features, and I'll go through them briefly. Fire and Forget Limited Wrapping Process Viewer 2D, which is a very advanced evolution of the process viewer, will allow you to put Fire and Forget, which means automatically deleted from the list, items into the process viewer, and it will take care of dropping them off the list and disposing of the memory. It's limited wrapping, meaning that it has an overall size. That size is rather large, and you can toggle wrapping, meaning that, and again, there's variants. So there's it starts with process viewer, then it starts with wrapping process viewer, then it becomes the limited wrapping process viewer, okay, where there's a certain limit at which you hit that limit and it either wrapping meaning the world wraps, or it doesn't wrap and it just is limited, and you get to a certain size and then you can't go beyond that. So this is done again for like scrolling background views with many layers, parallax. You can use it for just really anything like that, including AI. Or you can do or UIs. You can try different things with it. Then one variant that's slightly different is the ordered process viewer, And this takes advantage of a feature of the processor class that allows you to sort things in a Z order so that you can do like a point and click adventure, or maybe a kind of a pseudo 3D platformer, or like a double dragon style level, right? Where you can move forward and backward within this limited area, but things are Z sorted in the same way that you would expect them to be Z sorted in, say, I don't know, anything but like Mario 1. Okay, so then, or Mario 1 only. Mario 1, 2, 3, like those games. Because, we're not talking about 3D here. We're talking about 2D when we're talking about process. We're talking about 2D elements. Although they could be 3D, but they would be on it. These are all planar views, and then the height determines whether or not they're ordered, and you have to keep resorting because as the player moves, you have to keep resorting. But all of these things are kind of written for you as long as you know how to implement for them, which you can usually figure out by looking at some example or some test, or some implementation, or just the source code itself, because it's all together. All right, then there's the Z-sort FAF zoned process viewer. This allows you to do a really big area that's zoned. And what zoning is you break up a world into a grid. And then whenever the screen is overlapping sections of that grid, say up to 4, depending on how big the grid you make it, usually it's related to the screen size, you can have up to 4 of these grid sections active, meaning that the CPU is updating them. And then anything beyond that isn't being updated. And you would use this to do a platformer, or really anything where you didn't want to spend any CPU time on something that wasn't on the screen. So this is a good way to limit that scope. And then, there's a couple of other variations that you should look into, like zoned moving processor debugger, which you can use in the zoned. It's slightly different than the regular processor debugger. Zoned processors, which is the simplest form of zoning, allows you to create a grid, then optimize that grid. And there's just all sorts of features that are kind of buried in here. But all you really need to know is that processor itself has all of the functionality you need to create an interactable object in 2D or 2.5D. And processors is just a very simple list, which has been recently moved to processor. So it gets you into that. In a nutshell, that's all of the viewers. Briefly, before I go, I guess we'll look at the FX, and we'll just look at, like, for instance, what's a simple one? Well, let's look at buttons. It's not simple, but there's lots of different ones. So here we have a cool button, and this was displayed originally on a, well, it could be called directly, or you could put it into a slide of a presentation. And, these, you look at it as like, well, these are the settings. So it needs, it's a glowing button that has a sound when you hover over on the mouse. And you can set its text, and you can change its label. It's just a button, like you would see in a menu. Or maybe, just some UI element. And then it has a bunch of different color settings. One for the normal hover click, similar to like the web. And then it has these states. Am I hovering? Am I being clicked? And then there's this one feature, do not show backing in normal. And this is so you can just have a word that you put your mouse over and then the backing shows up. And by backing, I mean the button itself, not the word or label that's on it. And then there's, a couple of blending options. Maybe we should get into blending in another video. So look for that one. And that's cool button. Here's direct button, and it's just a slight riff on cool button. It seems to have almost all of the same features, probably so that it could be exactly plugged in, except that it requires one more option, which is, or I guess there's this blocker, and blocker blocks the button, maybe? Or, not sure. Let's see, what does blocker get used for? If blocker, stretch the blocker at the size of the button. Maybe this is to do like a sheen or something. Oh, maybe it's when you're using a semi-transparent. It's like another background, I guess. Interesting. All right, so then we have this slightly different approach, this direct button. And, one way to find out how these things exactly work would be to create them and stick them into a processors list in a window, or in a process viewer 2D. All right, moving on. There should be some other buttons in here. Okay, so here we have another button, text font cool button. So text fonts are bitmap fonts where you supply a bunch of individual bitmaps and it will load them as a font. And there are a couple packaged with the game or with this framework that you can select from. And it's going to ask you for that font. So you have to set these settings after creating, although it does have some defaults here. And then it will attempt to draw that button. Then there's cool button toggle. I assume this one has a little X next to it or is toggled on and off when you click it. Maybe no X, but just toggled on and off. Then there's ugly button. This uses a ugly font, which was this really old school way of drawing fonts that we do still have. It is available to you. And that was just for drawing a quick button somewhere. A lot of that was used in Empire in the Sky. So we're talking like 10 years ago I was using those. FX Cool Toggle is along the lines of the Cool family. It looks probably very similar to those buttons, and this one has a little on-off light next to it. And that's it. I mean, that's your mixed bag of buttons. But there are probably other ones in here somewhere that, like Mixed Bag has some random stuff. And, you got to read through all of this to see what you got. There's a whole toolbox in there, Goodness. So that's a very high level overview of what process is and what the processors are and what they're used for. Admittedly, it's a framework within a framework, so you should be able to find your way in that. And that's an overview. And maybe later we'll do one video on presentation slide and visual aid where I demonstrate the use of that. So please look for that. And if you like this video or you just want to help this project or you care about this project, please visit GitHub, sponsor us, subscribe to our videos on YouTube, give us a like, a thumbs up somewhere. We're not on Facebook, but it would be great if you could help support the project and keep the graphics flowing for our graphics addicts out there. Have a great day. We'll see you in the next video.